So one of my Subscribestar patrons has said, "Tick, you are a great researcher. What do you think of Antony Sutton's trilogy of Wall Street? The author explains perfectly that Wall Street financed the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, and FDR. You should check it out when you can. There are a lot of resources from the State Department, even letters." Well, you're not the only one who's asked about Sutton. Lots of comments in previous videos have told me to check out his books. There was one last week by Nick Hambley, for example, and plenty in the years before that. So, Antony C Sutton was a historian in the 1960s and 70s who wrote a load of books, including these most popular ones. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and FDR, and Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. I've read them, and I have watched a couple of videos and interviews on or by Antony Sutton. I'll leave a link to one below, and what I'm going to do here is first explain Sutton's theory, then briefly touch upon the evidence that he provides. We haven't got time to go through it all, and in the process explain what I think about the whole thing. But I just want to point out that I actually studied the Russian Revolution in college and university, as well as the Great Depression's impact on Britain, Germany and America, including FDR's policies relating to that. I've also done a bit of my own reading since then on those topics, and I'm saying this because I know some of my critics will be quick to dismiss anything I say about these topics because I haven't done a lot of videos on them. And yes, I obviously know more about Hitler and his ideology because this channel has been focused on the Second World War and therefore Hitler, but that doesn't mean I don't have any knowledge of topics outside of that. I will openly admit though that I'm not as knowledgeable on FDR's personal life or his business career, which is what Sutton talks about, but overall I'm not totally in the dark on these subjects, and I wanted to point that out before we get into the weeds of it. So, Sutton explains the motivation for a group that he calls the monopoly capitalists. He says that they want to use the state to grant them monopoly privileges in order to increase their power and wealth. Old John D. Rockefeller and his 19th century fellow capitalists were convinced of one absolute truth, that no great monetary wealth could be accumulated under the impartial rules of a competitive laissez-faire society. The only sure road to the acquisition of massive wealth was monopoly. Drive out your competitors, reduce competition, eliminate laissez-faire, and above all, get state protection for your industry through compliant politicians and government regulation. This last avenue yields a legal monopoly, and a legal monopoly always leads to wealth. This strategy was detailed in 1906 by Frederick C. Howe in his Confessions of a Monopolist. This is the story of something for nothing, of making the other fellow pay. This making the other fellow pay of getting something for nothing explains the lust for franchises, mining rights, tariff privileges, railway control, tax evasions. All these things mean monopoly, and all monopoly is buttoned on legislation. Okay, I don't think anyone would disagree with this so far. I think this is true, and I think many free market guys like myself will agree that monopolies are bad. Plus, the entire socialist left would also agree with this, since that's the whole criticism of capitalism, the idea that it leads to monopolies and the crushing of the workers. They may not understand that the only way monopolies form is through state intervention in the market, the very thing they're calling for. In other words, socialist policies are causing the capitalist monopolies that the socialists don't like, yet they keep calling for more socialist policies. But at the very least, they do agree that capitalism forms monopolies. So far, so good. Sutton says that the traditional left versus right political spectrum is bogus. I agree. He says that it's really about people who want individual freedom versus people who want centralised political control. I agree. And he says that because they are monopolists, the state socialists and the monopoly capitalists are actually on the same side. But this alliance is hidden from the common man. Consequently, one barrier to mature understanding of recent history is the notion that all capitalists are the bitter and unswerving enemies of all Marxists and socialists. This erroneous idea originated with Karl Marx and was undoubtedly useful to his purposes. In fact, the idea is nonsense. there has been a continuing, albeit concealed, alliance between international political capitalists and international revolutionary socialists to their mutual benefit. This alliance has gone unobserved largely because historians, with a few notable exceptions, have an unconscious Marxian bias and are thus locked into the impossibility of any such alliance existing. The open-minded reader should bear two clues in mind. Monopoly capitalists are the bitter enemies of laissez-faire entrepreneurs, and given the weaknesses of socialist central planning, the totalitarian socialist state is a perfect captive market for monopoly capitalists if an alliance can be made with the socialist power brokers. So, in a nutshell, his theory is that there is a mutually benefiting partnership between international monopoly capitalists and international revolutionary socialism, which has been largely ignored or hidden from view. And yes, given recent events, I could definitely see this being the case. Think about it this way. Why would Jeff Bezos call for a raise in the minimum wage? Wouldn't this hurt his own business? Well, no, because Amazon can afford to pay their workers more. But Jeff Bezos' smaller competitors cannot afford to pay a higher minimum wage, driving them out of business, increasing Amazon's power, and enriching Bezos even more. So not only does this socialist policy help make Bezos even richer, it makes his own employees happier, and he can boast to them about how great and caring he is to the plight of the workers. Never mind all the millions of other workers driven out of their jobs as a result of them raising the minimum wage. Isn't Jeff Bezos a great guy? It's the same reason Henry Ford famously paid his workers double the rate of most other workers and advocated for the 5-day week and pushed anti-Semitism just like Karl Marx. It's the same strategy of driving out competition and forming monopolies. So I can certainly see why monopoly capitalists and monopoly socialists might be in an alliance with one another, considering that such a partnership is mutually beneficial. Profit for the capitalists, financial support for the revolutionaries. A perfect match. Bolshevists and bankers have then this significant common ground: internationalism. Revolution and international finance are not at all inconsistent if the result of revolution is to establish more centralized authority. International finance prefers to deal with central governments. The last thing the banking community wants is laissez-faire economy and decentralized power because these would disperse power. As a supporter of free market economics, this is roughly how I see it too. Whether there's an actual formal alliance between these factions or not, or whether their leaders are one and the same, I'm not sure, although I'm open to the idea. However, I do think that the end goal of the socialists and the monopoly capitalists is the same: total monopolistic power, totalitarianism. But even if we accept this as fact, why would the monopoly capitalists in the United States want to support the Bolsheviks in Russia? What could possibly be their motivation there? Well, Sutton explains this. Russia was then and is today the largest untapped market in the world. Moreover, Russia then and now constituted the greatest potential competitive threat to American industrial and financial supremacy. A glance at a world map is sufficient to spotlight the geographical difference between the vast landmass of Russia and the smaller United States. Wall Street must have cold shivers when it visualizes Russia as a second super-American industrial giant. Thus, the monopoly capitalists of Wall Street and Britain and Germany too supported Lenin and Trotsky and others in their quest to bring down Tsarist Russia and convert it into a monopoly that benefited both parties. Instead of destroying the monarchy and opening up the market to allow the economy to function without restriction, Russia was converted into a captive market colony that was then exploited by the Bolsheviks and American corporations. Wall Street went to bat in Washington for the Bolsheviks. It succeeded. The Soviet totalitarian regime survived. In the 1930s, foreign firms, mostly the Morgan Rockefeller Group, built the 5-year plans. They have continued to build Russia economically and militarily. What the United States wanted, or what Wall Street wanted, was a captive market. And of course, socialism is a captive market, because my earlier studies at Stanford University had brought up the fact that a socialist system cannot innovate. It's got to import innovation and technology from the West, and so I think the aim behind this was to encourage the development of Marxism and other types of socialism, because this would give these Wall Street bankers control of a world market, a captive market. Okay, this makes sense. If you close off a market and render it unable to actually function, which is essentially what socialism does, it paralyzes the economy, then a business on the outside with special monopoly trade rights could produce products to sell in the captive socialist market, making a profit. Alright, I can see why monopoly capitalists would be eager to fund and otherwise support socialist regimes and movements. But what's the evidence for this? Well, Sutton shows that Trotsky was living in the United States in early 1917 on a budget that he certainly couldn't have afforded without outside help. He had a chauffeured limousine, a refrigerator and a telephone, privileges in those days, and even though he only made $244 in income, he gave $310 to his friends, on top of all those other expenses. Sutton also provides evidence showing that at least $10,000 was provided to Trotsky from either American or German origin. This $10,000 was found on him when he travelled by ship through Canada, where he was stopped by a British lieutenant colonel working for the Canadian Intelligence Service. But he was then let go and sailed to Russia thanks to a passport and a British transit visa provided to him by Woodrow Wilson. Sutton also provides evidence relating to Lenin getting funding from Germany, a point that mainstream historians also agree with, so there's nothing controversial about that. But he also shows that Woodrow Wilson ordered his government not to interfere with the Bolshevik Revolution on the 28th of November 1917, and that rumours were going about at the time that many of the Bolsheviks were actually from America, like Trotsky. He also shows anecdotal evidence from Russia itself, including a Russian newspaper writing in 1917 that the American capitalists were funding the revolutionaries because they wanted to get a firm foothold in the future captive Russian market. There's more evidence besides this, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples here so that you get the idea that he's not just making up theories. He is providing evidence to back up a lot of his claims. Okay, great. So we know about the Bolshevik Revolution, but what about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Well, this one's a bit easier to confirm. While FDR's supporters and numerous historians paint him as an enemy of the international banking elite, and FDR himself made out to be just that in his speeches and so on, this view is simply wrong. According to the Delano family themselves, which Roosevelt was a part of, not only was Roosevelt related to a third of the people in the Senate, but also numerous American presidents and generals, and Winston Churchill, who was his 8th cousin once removed. His family included railway tycoons, bankers, and insurers, as well as other types of businessmen. Roosevelt himself was a man of Wall Street. To be specific, Franklin D. Roosevelt was, at one time or another during the 1920s, a vice president of the Fidelity and Deposit Company 120 Broadway, the president of an industry trade association, the American Construction Council 28 West 44th Street, a partner in Roosevelt and O'Connor 120 Broadway, a partner in Marvin, Hooker and Roosevelt 52nd Wall Street, the president of United European Investors Limited, 7 Pine Street, a director of International Germanic Trust Inc. in the Standard Oil Building at 26 Broadway, a director of Consolidated Automatic Merchandising Corporation, a paper organization, a trustee of Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, 120 Broadway, a director of American Investigation Corporation, 37 to 39 Pine Street, a director of Sanitary Postage Service Corporation, 285 Madison Avenue, the chairman of the General Trust Company, 15 Broad Street, a director of Photomaton, 551 Fifth Avenue, a director of Mantical Oil Corporation, Rock Springs, Wyoming, and an incorporator of the Federal International Investment Trust. According to Sutton, Wall Street stopped supporting Hoover in 1932 because he wouldn't adopt General Electric's swope plan. They threw in their lot with FDR because he accepted it, and the plan became FDR's National Insurance Recovery Act. Again, there's loads more to this, but you get the point. So we know about the Bolshevik Revolution and FDR, but what about the National Socialists in Germany? They're a little bit different, right? So what reason does Sutton give for Wall Street funding them? US multinationals under the control of Wall Street profited handsomely from Hitler's military construction program in the 1930s and at least until 1942. This group of international bankers backed the Bolshevik Revolution and subsequently profited from the establishment of a Soviet socialism. This group also backed Hitler and certainly profited from German armament in the 1930s, when big business should have been running its business operations at Ford Motor, Standard of New Jersey, and so on. We find it actively and deeply involved in political upheavals, war, and revolutions in 3 major countries. Okay, this is where I disagree with Sutton. Financial motivations might explain why Wall Street supported the Nazi movement in the 1930s, possibly up until 1942, but it doesn't explain the Second World War. I can understand the desire to make an autarkic monopoly in Central Europe that could be exploited by the corporations. I mean, that's exactly what the European Union is for. But why specifically the Nazis? And why back a particular ideology whose aim was to strike and take down the Soviet Union that you've already got a monopoly on? Supposedly, according to Sutton, the Soviet Union was created to be a captive market for Wall Street. So by funding the Nazis to take on the Soviet Union, you're destroying what you've already built, which makes no sense. And also, Hitler was very vocal about his hatred of the monopoly capitalists in both America and Britain. Mein Kampf and his speeches and table talks are all about how he doesn't like what he calls international Jewish finance. So how does Sutton square this circle? Well, the answer is he doesn't. He talks about Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, being a central banker that Hitler was in with, but forgets that Hitler fell out with Schacht and replaced him as Reichsminister of Economics in 1937 with Goering, and president of the Reichsbank in January 1939 with Walter Funk, a National Socialist. So the international banker, Schacht, was not running the show in Germany when Hitler took the country to war. Schacht ended up in the concentration camps in 1944. That doesn't sound like Hitler was on the side of the international bankers. If Hitler had just captured Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia and stayed there without expanding, creating a captive market in Central Europe and then allying herself with the Soviet Union, so everything up until June 1941, I would have said that Sutton might have had a point. But he didn't do that. He went to war and fought both the West and the East, all the while saying he was fighting against international bankers, which he was if the international bankers were in Britain, America and the Soviet Union, all countries he went to war with. So this is where Sutton's theory breaks down. He also doesn't explain FDR's or the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War. His books show that FDR and the Soviet Union were set up by Wall Street, but nothing beyond that. Sutton's take raises more questions than it answers. So, if Wall Street funded FDR, Stalin and Hitler, why not just carve up the world between these 3 powers, rather than have 2 of them destroy the 3rd? We know from last week's video on Operation Unthinkable that Roosevelt wanted to dismantle the British Empire because it stood in the way of America's global ambitions. So why didn't America team up with Germany and the Soviet Union against Britain? If they were all working for Wall Street, surely Britain would have been a softer target. Also, if Hitler was in league with Wall Street, or was their puppet, why would he get into drugs and then end himself in 1945? Of course, I'm sure some will argue that he actually fled to Argentina or whatever. But then I would say, well, why didn't he just flee to the secret Nazi occult base on the moon? It's not like he didn't have rockets. Sutton tries to make the case that Wall Street wanted him to take down France with Germany, but forgets that Hitler was going east. It wasn't his intention to go west. He only ended up going west because of circumstances, and I guess someone like Sutton would argue that Britain's guarantee on Poland was a setup for this, but that's playing 4D chess. Germany had failed to take down France in the First World War, so why would the monopoly capitalists bet on her succeeding against France in the Second World War? Again, we're using hindsight here to blind us to the truth. Hitler was going east, not west, partly because recent history had shown that the Soviet Union, the Russians, had been a weaker power than France in the First World War. It was an easier target, he thought, plus it would get him the land and resources he needed to create his socialist paradise. Therefore, he wasn't going to fight France, and it was only really by accident that he fought France in 1940. So saying that Wall Street backed Hitler because they wanted to take down France doesn't hold up. I don't think Sutton's theory makes sense with regards to the Second World War, unless Hitler went renegade. Maybe Hitler tricked Wall Street into backing him in the 1930s and then stabbed them in the back in the 1940s. That kind of works. I'm trying to give as much benefit of the doubt as possible to Sutton here because there is some evidence that there was collaboration between Wall Street and Hitler in the 1930s, and he even shows some funding of the Nazis after America had gone to war with Germany. He talks about Standard Oil, General Electric, Henry Ford and others funding the Nazis at various points from 1922 to 1944, or giving them the technology to actually wage the war. Qualified observers have argued that Germany could not have gone to war in 1939 without IG Farben. Between 1927 and the beginning of World War II, IG Farben doubled in size, an expansion made possible in great part by American technical assistance and by American bond issues, such as the one for $30 million offered by National City Bank. By 1939, IG acquired a participation and managerial influence in some 380 other German firms and over 500 foreign firms. The Farben Empire owned its own coal mines, its own electric power plants, iron and steel units, banks, research units, and numerous commercial enterprises. There were over 2,000 cartel agreements between IG and foreign firms, including Standard Oil of New Jersey, DuPont, Alcoa, Dow Chemical, and others in the United States. Directors of Farben firms included not only Germans but also prominent American financiers. The process for manufacturing tetraethyl lead, essential for aviation gasoline, was obtained by IG Farben from the United States, and in 1939 IG was sold $20 million of high-grade aviation gasoline by Standard Oil of New Jersey. Even before Germany manufactured tetraethyl lead by the American process, it was able to borrow 500 tons from the Ethyl Corporation. Chemnico's vice president in New York was Rudolf Ilgner, an American citizen and brother of German IG Farben director Max Ilgner. If you want to see all the evidence Sutton provides, you're going to have to read the book because there's a lot of it. However, while Sutton shows that Wall Street monopolists backed Hitler in the 1933 election and helped set up a lot of the monopoly corporations that the Nazi state nationalised, and this was all done for profit reasons, he doesn't explain why Wall Street would want the Second World War. He also doesn't show that Hitler was in league with or was a puppet of international finance, which is what some believe. He only shows that there was a connection and some funding, not that Wall Street had any power at all over the Nazi leadership. Hitler may have accepted their funds because he wanted to get into power, not because he was their puppet or ally. Never look a gift horse in the mouth, after all, especially when you're massively in debt. Down to 1929, Hitler's party appears to have lived in the main on membership dues and individual gifts, mainly from local South German producers. A donation by Fritz Thyssen in 1923 remained an isolated fact. Even the party's increasing intimacy with Emil Kerdorf did not change the picture. Compared to the increasing indebtedness of the party, which by 1933 rose to 70 to 90 million Reichsmarks, these payments were only a drop in the bucket. Hitler had no choice but to secure funding in order to grow his party and get into power. The Nazis went into a stupid amount of debt to do this, and so Hitler had no choice but to emphasise the nationalist element of the party over the socialist element and convince the industrialists that his was the only party that could stop the rise of the communists, the latter viewed as a much bigger threat to the German businessmen. Is it not simply the case that the financiers mistakenly believed, as many people do today, that Hitler was a capitalist conservative who only put socialism in the name to trick the workers? If that was the case, they would fund Hitler to keep the communists out and thus keep Germany open for business, which they could profit from. Of course, we now know that they were mistaken because Hitler closed the country down and threw out most of the foreigners and investors, but they wouldn't have known that during the period he was trying to get into power, which is when he kept his mouth shut on his economic intentions. That sounds like a much better theory than they wanted a war against the Soviet Union which they could then profit from. Or they wanted a war against France for some reason even though Hitler was going east. But while there were concessions with the industrialists up until Hitler had consolidated power in the mid-1930s, I'm not convinced that Hitler was their puppet. I think it was the other way around. It was the Great Depression and they were scared of the communists, the KPD, and so sided with Hitler and the National Socialists hoping for a better deal. I think this is why Hitler said he wasn't going to nationalise the industries so long as the business leaders did what he said. So long as they towed the party line and implemented some changes, like employing a bunch of brown shirts in their factories or rationing inputs and outputs, they could continue to manage and profit from their businesses. Any that wouldn't would then be nationalised. To me, it makes more sense that Hitler dictated to them than the other way around. And also, German industrialists are not Wall Street. Yes, some had relations who worked on Wall Street and money was flowing around, which it does in an economy, but that doesn't mean it was Wall Street commanding Hitler. All Sutton has done is shown that there was a connection between American and German monopoly capitalists and a partial funding of the National Socialist Party at times, but nowhere near enough evidence to make a solid link. It doesn't prove that Hitler was a puppet of the international bankers. It doesn't prove that the American monopoly capitalists were pro-war, and his explanation for their motivations is severely lacking. He's jumped to the conclusion that Wall Street was behind everything, even though the evidence of Wall Street's direct involvement in the National Socialist movement is, at best, remote. As far as I'm concerned, his books on the Bolshevik Revolution and FDR have more weight to them. The theory makes sense, and the evidence supports it, although there are problems with the theory, such as why the Soviets and Americans would be at each other's throats at times, not just publicly, but privately too. And there may not be enough evidence to confirm Sutton's theory, and Sutton himself admits that there's not enough evidence to convincingly conclude that his theory is true, but at least in regards to FDR and the Bolsheviks, it makes sense, and I could then say, yeah, more work needs to be done on the subject, but it makes sense. But his book on the funding of the Nazis doesn't really hold up. Yes, there's some evidence there, but the motivation behind it is lacking, and is contradicted by other factors. Worse, I think people are taking his work at face value and then jumping to ridiculous conclusions about Hitler being a puppet of the international bankers and things like that. Well, sorry, but the evidence presented doesn't support anything like that. I'll give but one example here. There was a guy recently from Russia saying that Churchill wanted to attack Stalin, not the other way around. Which is precisely what I said in the video he was commenting on, so instead of telling me to learn other languages, this guy should learn how to open his ears. But he also said Churchill was already attacking Russia in the 1920s, even though Churchill wasn't in power in the 1920s. Well done. And British and American capitalists funded Hitler because they looked for someone in Germany who would attack the Soviet Union. Except, as this other commenter was correct to point out, that it was the same British and American capitalists who also funded the Soviet Union. So we can see that this Russian guy has jumped to false and contradictory conclusions based on ideas similar to what Sutton is talking about. People have also accused me in the past of not reading Sutton's books and therefore being blind to the real truth. In fact, I read Sutton's books on Hitler and the Russian Revolution a while ago. I only read the FDR one last week in preparation for this video, but I read the others way before this. People are saying that my analysis in recent videos are deficient because I just haven't realised it's the banking elite really pulling the strings. But I've now read the books, and I'm telling you, the one on Hitler, at least, doesn't support the conclusion. The Nazis might have got funding, but that doesn't mean the banking elite are pulling the strings. Roosevelt is part of the elite, so fair enough regarding him, but apart from the Bolsheviks gaining into power and then some technological and resource trades, I'm not seeing how the banking elite are pulling the strings there either. And the thing is, I'm open and willing to this idea. I'm a free market guy. I don't like the central banks. I don't like the corporations. I don't like FDR or Hitler or the commie-servatives. And yes, I did just say that. Monopoly capitalists and socialists are two sides of the same coin. So yeah, if there was enough evidence, I'd happily accept this idea. But I don't think there's nearly enough evidence to conclude that every single major event in the past 100 years has been a result of a secret cabal of banking elite. Yes, I'm sure some of them have been, but not all. There's definitely not enough evidence regarding Hitler, and Wall Street might have helped the Bolsheviks get into power, but I'm skeptical that they were running the country as a captive colony. They might have been, but I'm not seeing enough evidence of that. Even still, this theory has some potential. And Sutton's books are certainly better than the ones saying that Hitler was a British agent. So I will keep an open mind. Maybe evidence can be presented that convinces me that this theory is true. And if anyone has any decent suggestions to, on books to follow up on, let me know, especially regarding Hitler, because that's the one bit that Sutton seems to fall flat on. Obviously, I'd like to hear people's opinions on this theory as well, so comment below. Have you read Sutton? What do you think about the books? And for more mind-blowing theories of history, check out these videos right here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.